Chapter 1: Low Tide. The bus dropped Doyun off at the top of the hill, where the road stopped pretending to be a road and became a cracked ribbon of asphalt sliding down toward the water. He stood there with his duffel bag over one shoulder and let the wind off the sea push at him. It smelled exactly the way it always had: salt and diesel and the green rot of kelp drying on the rocks. For just a second he was 9 years old again, tearing down this same hill with his sandals slapping against his heels and his father's laugh somewhere behind him. Then the bus pulled away and he was 28 and his father was dead. Junpo hadn't changed. He'd expected it to look smaller, the way childhood places are supposed to shrink when you come back. But the town just sat there in the gray afternoon exactly as he remembered it. The row of low houses with their blue-tiled roofs. The harbor, where a dozen fishing boats nodded against the pier. The mountains came right down to the sea here, squeezing the whole town into a narrow crescent between the slopes and the water. He started down the hill. His knees ached from 4 hours on the bus. His phone had died around the second hour and he hadn't bothered charging it. The funeral had been 11 days ago. He'd stood at the back in a borrowed black suit while his mother held his hand so tight the bones ground together. And afterward everyone ate the funeral meal and spoke in low voices about what a good man Han Seong-ho had been, and not one of them said a word about the restaurant. Because everyone already knew, the restaurant was finished. His father dying had just made it official. The sign still hung over the door, and the sight of it stopped him in the street. Himeji, greeting the sea. The characters were carved into a slab of driftwood his father had pulled off the beach the summer before Doyun was born, sanded smooth and lacquered and hung with pride over the entrance. He could still picture his father up on a chair doing it, his mother holding the chair steady and scolding him. "You'll break your neck, old man, and then who's going to cook?" The lacquer had gone milky now and the driftwood had cracked, and a streak of sawdust ran down from one of the iron hooks. But you could still read it. Below the sign, the restaurant looked like something that had drowned and been left out to dry. The window was thick with grime. Behind it he could make out overturned chairs. Dead leaves had piled against the base of the door. A neighbor had taped a piece of paper to the glass reading temporarily closed in his mother's handwriting, but the tape had given at one corner and the paper hung crooked in the damp. The key was right where it had always been, on a nail under the wooden bench by the door. His father had never locked anything that truly mattered and always locked the restaurant, like the recipes were worth stealing. Doyun's fingers found the cold metal on the first try, and that small thing, his hand still knowing the spot after 10 years, put an ache in his chest he hadn't been ready for. He shoved his shoulder into the door, and it gave with a shriek of swollen wood. The smell hit him first. Not rot, just absence. Cold oil gone solid in the fryers, dust, the flat breath of a building closed too long. And underneath, faint and almost gone, the smell he'd actually been dreading. The ghost of 1,000 dinners. Grilled fish and garlic and the sweet sharp tang of his father's soy braise, soaked so deep into the wooden walls that no amount of emptiness would ever get it out. He found the light switch. Half the fluorescent tubes were dead. The ones that worked threw a sickly gray light over the dining room, and it was worse than he'd let himself imagine. Every table was buried. Stacks of yellowed newspapers, cardboard boxes soft with damp, a broken radio, fishing line tangled around a reel, 3 different brooms leaning in 3 different corners, none used in a long time, like 3 men who'd all given up on the same job. The open kitchen behind the counter sat under a film of grease and dust so even it almost looked deliberate. The big cast-iron grill, the 2-burner range, the long steel prep counter, scarred white from a lifetime of knife work. And taped to the side of the refrigerator, sun-faded almost to nothing, a child's drawing in crayon. A stick figure in a tall white hat holding a fish nearly as big as himself, and beside him a smaller stick figure, and above them both in the wobbly letters of a 6-year-old, Appa and me. Doyun looked at it for a long time. He'd drawn that. He knew the fish. It was the giant grouper his father had pulled from the deep water the spring Doyun turned 6, the one he'd carried home over his shoulder while half the town came out to sea. His father had hung it on the refrigerator the day Doyun gave it to him and never once took it down. Not in 22 years. Not when Doyun stopped coming home. Not when the calls got short and then rare and then stopped. Not when Doyun took the job in Seoul that meant so little he could lose it in a single morning, which he had 8 months ago, and told no one. He worked until dark because working was easier than thinking. The dining room was wrecked, but the bones were good. The tables were solid hardwood, the kind nobody made anymore. The kitchen was better than it looked. His father had cleaned every blade and seasoned every pan right up to the end. The neglect was all on the surface, dust over good steel. The range still lit, a blue flame jumping up when he turned the first burner, and that small, faithful flame undid him more than anything else in the building. The place wasn't dead. It had just been left. At the very back, past the kitchen, behind a door he'd half forgotten, was the storeroom. He pushed it open and found diving gear. He'd forgotten. Of course he had. He'd been a child, then a teenager who wanted nothing to do with this town, then a man who lived 4 hours away and called twice a year. Somewhere across all of that, the most important fact about his father had quietly slipped away. His father had been a diver. Not the way the Hineo grandmothers were divers. Han Seong-ho had used tanks. He'd gone deep. That was the secret behind Himeji's reputation. He didn't buy fish at the market. He went down and got it himself before dawn, so whatever hit the grill had been swimming an hour before. People drove from 2 provinces over to taste the difference. A buoyancy vest hung from a hook strapped stiff with old salt. 2 steel tanks, paint chipped to bare metal. A regulator in a mesh bag, mouthpiece yellowed. A mask, fins cracked at the foot pockets, a weight belt, a dive knife. And on the shelf above it all, slightly apart, a small water-stained book bound in cracked navy vinyl. He'd seen it 100 times as a boy. His father bent over it at the prep counter after closing with a pencil in his hand. He'd always assumed it was a ledger, the accounts. It was a dive log. Page after page in his father's small, careful handwriting. Dates going back further than Doyun was old. A column for the site, written in private shorthand. Off the black rock, 2 boat lengths past the kelp line, the shelf where the current turns. Depth, water temperature, time. And then in the widest column, what he'd brought up, and below that almost every time, a single line about what he'd made and who had eaten it, and whether they'd gone home happy. Grouper, 6 kilograms, the deep shelf. Braised whole for the Yoon family, the grandfather's 80th. He cried, good day. Abalone 12, the East Reef, porridge. The Seoul couple came back 3 nights running. The entries got thinner as the years went on. The handwriting grew shakier. Long gaps appeared. The depths got shallower. Near the end, the column for what I cooked was mostly blank, the dive recorded with nothing made of it, like his father had kept going out of habit or loneliness, long after the customers stopped coming. The last entry was dated 14 months ago. The deep shelf again. Couldn't get down to it. Too old now. Saw the big one anyway, still there after all these years, sitting in the dark like it's waiting for somebody. Some other diver will have to go get him. Not me. Not anymore. He'd inherited a question his father hadn't been able to answer. The house up the lane was warm and small and bright, and his mother had made too much food, the way she always did when she was frightened. She was thinner than he remembered. She took his coat and scolded him for not charging his phone. I called the station 4 times. I was sure the bus had gone off the road, and steered him down to the low table and put a bowl in front of him before he could say a word. His sister was there too. Han Doyun, 19, in a convenience store uniform with her name on a tag above the pocket. She'd taken the night shifts at the store by the highway to help with the bills and given up the university place she'd spent 4 years working toward. His mother told him this later in the kitchen in a whisper, while Doyun sat in the other room with the television on low. She deferred a year. She says it's only a year, Doyun. It is not going to be only a year. Doyun didn't speak much at dinner. She ate quickly, the way someone eats when they're due somewhere in an hour, and she watched Doyun across the table with an expression he couldn't quite read and didn't try to. She'd been 11 the last time he really lived here. He didn't actually know who she was now, only what she'd become while he was gone, and the difference between those two things sat between them through the whole meal. When the dishes were cleared, his mother folded her hands and said what she'd been holding since he walked in. There's a man who wants to buy the building, for the land. He came twice while your father was sick. After the debt, there'd be almost nothing left, but it would be clean, Doyun. You could go back to Seoul to your work. I lost the job, Doyun said. The room went still. Even the television in the other room seemed to quiet. He hadn't planned to say it, but sitting there with his father's dive log a cold weight in his coat pocket, the secret got too heavy to carry one more minute. The company folded 8 months ago. I've been getting by. He made himself look at his mother. I'm not going back to Seoul. There's nothing up there to go back to. She reached across and took his hand, her grip lighter than it used to be. Then we sell. We start fresh. I'm not selling it, Doyun said. I'm going to reopen it. He heard those words leave his mouth and was about as surprised as she was. He'd gone into that storeroom a man with a problem and come out with a decision, already made somewhere he didn't have access to. Doyun, her voice went gentle, you don't know how to run a restaurant. I know that, he said. You don't know how to cook, not the way he did. I know that too. I'm going to learn. I'm not asking you to believe it'll work. What I'm asking for is 6 months. If I can't make something of it by then, we sell and I'll never bring it up again. The man who wants the land can wait 6 months. Appa built that place with his own hands. I can't let a stranger pour concrete over it without trying. Doyun appeared in the doorway. She'd changed out of the uniform into her own clothes, a jacket over her arm, keys in her hand. Night shift. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you've already decided what you think and you're just confirming it. I heard all that, she said. Doyun, his mother said. It's fine, I'm just saying. She looked at Doyun and the look was level, no cruelty in it, which somehow made it harder to argue with. You left when I was 11. You came back for the funeral and then you left again. And now you're here because you lost your job and you want to reopen Appa's restaurant and you don't know how to cook and you don't know how to dive and you've never run anything except spreadsheets. She paused. You don't even know what he put in the soup. Doyun didn't say anything. She pulled the jacket on and picked up her bag. I hope it works out, she said in the tone of someone who didn't. I'll be back in the morning. The front door closed behind her. Not hard, just closed, and that was that. His mother sat across from Doyun and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, quietly, 6 months, and it wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either, and that was the best he was going to get tonight. He went back to the restaurant alone near midnight because he couldn't sleep. The tide was out. He could hear it pulling back over the rocks, that long, slow hush of water uncovering everything it had been hiding. Low tide is the sea telling you its secrets, his father used to say. Everything it keeps comes up to the air. You just have to be there to listen. He went straight through to the kitchen and switched on the single lamp over the prep counter, and the yellow circle of it fell on the scarred steel exactly the way it always had. He'd brought the dive log. He set it down in the light. Then he unwrapped the knife. His father's kitchen knife, a heavy single bevel deba his own father had given him, the steel worn thin from 40 years of sharpening, the wooden handle shaped by use to fit one particular hand. He'd found it that afternoon in the top drawer of the prep station, wrapped in oiled cloth, the only thing in the ruined kitchen that had been properly protected. His father had cleaned it and put it away carefully, probably the last thing he did. Doyun picked it up, heavier than it looked. His hand had no idea what to do with it. He thought about his sister's face in the doorway, his mother's lighter grip, the drawing on the refrigerator. "All right, Appa," he said quietly to the empty kitchen to the knife. "I need you to teach me. I don't know where else to start." He knew there'd be no answer. So when a pane of pale blue light unfolded itself out of nothing above the prep counter, silent and patient, hanging in the dark like a window into somewhere else, Han Doyun did the only sensible thing. He dropped the knife, stumbled back into the shelving, and sent a stack of pots crashing to the floor. The blue light waited while the pots rolled and clattered and came to rest. When everything was still, it arranged itself gently into words he could read as clearly as if they'd been written on the inside of his eyes. The words read, "Welcome to the Tide Table Kitchen." And below that, smaller, "Shall we begin, Han Doyun?" Chapter 2, The System Wakes. Doyun didn't move for a long time. He stood with his back against the shelving, and the pots scattered around his feet, and watched the blue light hanging there in the dark above the prep counter, and he waited for it to be something he could explain. He was exhausted, he was grieving. The lamp was old, the wiring older, a reflection, a strange angle of light, except the light didn't shift when he moved, and it was there no matter where he turned his head. Left, right, up at the ceiling, back down at the floor. The words sat in the center of his vision like they were printed on the inside of his eye. The words read, "Shall we begin, Han Doyun?" "No," Doyun said. "I don't think I'm ready for that." The words stayed exactly as they were. He could leave. He could go up the lane, get into bed, and decide in the morning that exhaustion had done something to his head. That was the sensible choice. He looked at the words a moment longer. His mother's grip was lighter than it used to be. His sister thought he was going to fail. He'd told them 6 months and he had no plan, and here was something impossible offering to begin. "Yes," he said. "All right, let's begin." The blue pane brightened slightly and started to unfold. It built itself one piece at a time, like someone laying tools out on a clean surface. The system stated things, waited, and left the understanding to him. The words read, "The Tide Table Kitchen, a system for one who would feed the living with what the sea gives." Then operator registered, Han Doyun, inheritance confirmed. What does that mean? What inheritance? Previous operator, Han Seong-ho, deceased. Binding passed to the nearest blood to return to the water. You returned, confirmed. He had this the whole time, Doyun said, and he never said a word about it. The system didn't respond. He wasn't really talking to it. He was talking to his father, and his father wasn't there, and whatever this thing was, it didn't pretend otherwise. The grief came up then, the way it had been doing for 11 days. His father had carried this for 30 years, completely alone. Through the good years and the slow decline and the last winters when he'd kept going to the water and coming back with nothing, the whole time this had been waiting in the dark above his knife, while the man it was bound to got too old to use it. Some other diver will have to go get him. His father hadn't been writing about the fish. He'd been writing about this, about handing something down the only way he had left, into a log he trusted his son would eventually come home and open. "All right," Doyun said, "teach me. That's what I came in here asking for." The blue pane widened and a structure took shape. Clean, uncluttered, at the top his name, below that. Level 1, title none. 2 columns side by side. The first was the kitchen, knife work level 1, fire and heat level 1, palette level 1. A note that locked disciplines would open in time. The second was the water, diving level 1, breath level 1, the eye level 1. He understood immediately why they were together. The diving existed to feed the cooking. The cooking was the reason to dive. His father had spent 30 years getting good at both ends of it because you couldn't have one without the other. The eye and breath, what are those? The eye, level 1. The diver's sense for what is worth taking rises with use. His father's voice came to him. Low tide is the sea telling you its secrets. Everything it keeps comes up to the air. You just have to be there to listen. He understood the skill better from that memory than from the definition. And how do the levels go up? The system showed him three things, one after the other. The first was the catch. Each thing taken from the sea is weighed for rarity, size, and difficulty of the taking. The reward is paid in pearls. A small symbol appeared, a stylized drop with the inner sheen of something formed under pressure. His counter settled at 0. Rarity, size, difficulty. The harder the taking, the more it paid. The clearest contract anyone had offered him in years. The second was the meal. Each dish is graded. The grade pays pearls. A scale 6 levels. 1 star was poor, 2 was plain, 3 was good, 4 was fine, 5 was exceptional, 6 was perfect. He thought about the dive log entries. He cried, "Good day." The couple who came back 3 nights running. His father had spent 30 years working toward that top grade, and maybe one day Doyun would earn the right to see how many times he'd reached it. For now he was on the bottom rung. He hadn't cooked a single thing. The third, the system held back until it had dimmed everything else. Resonance. A meal cooked for the right person in the right moment pays beyond its grade. Learn the guest, cook what they need. No further explanation. He'd eaten in his father's restaurant for the first 8 years of his life, and had only now, standing in the dark at 28, understood what he'd been watching. His father almost never made the same thing for 2 tables. People thought he was difficult. He was paying attention. A man would come in carrying something heavy, and Han Seong-ho would set down something that tasted like before the wait arrived, and the man would leave without it. He thought about 10 years of dashboards and metrics that measured everything a transaction could be and nothing a person was. He'd been good at that work. He'd optimized toward numbers that fed no one. Here was a system that paid you for listening. His father had built a whole life on that and died with debts, and was remembered by everyone at the funeral as a good man. Doyun used to think that was 2 facts that added up to a tragedy. He was starting to think it was just the truth. The pane opened onto a shop. Shelves, most of them locked, the locked ones rendered as faint outlines like objects seen through fog. 4 categories: the water diving equipment, the fire kitchen tools, the room furnishings, the larder ingredients the sea couldn't provide. Better gear meant deeper dives and rarer catches. Better tools raised the ceiling of what he could cook. Better furnishings kept guests at the table, and a guest who stayed was one he could learn, and a guest he learned was resonance. 1 closed loop: dive to earn, cook to earn, spend to go deeper and cook better. The wheel would turn faster the longer he kept feeding people well. He could see how to break it. The old office instinct was already scanning for shortcuts. Dive safe and easy. Cook the same dish on repeat. Treat guests as variables. He looked at the 4 glowing words and thought about the man who'd left lighter than he came in, and found he didn't want to. Then the pain did something deliberate. Everything dimmed. Every shelf and column drawing back until there was just a single line of light left, held there long enough that he knew it wasn't an accident. The words read, "A new operator is not sent down into the cold with nothing." Then the previous operator left his tools well. He cleaned every blade and seasoned every pan. He oiled the gear and hung it dry. What a man cares for, the tide table kitchen will not let rot. From the storeroom at the back of the building, something began to hum. A thread of blue light slipped under the storeroom door and ran along the kitchen floor. He followed it past the counter, past the cold grill, and pushed the door open. The blue light filled the small space completely, moving over the gear. His father's gear. The vest stiff with salt, the regulator yellowed, the fins cracked, the suit perished at the folds, the tanks chipped to bare metal. The light moved over all of it slow and even, the way the tide moves over stones. Where the light passed, things changed. No dramatic flash, just a quiet correction. He watched the salt lift from the wetsuit seams and the material soften and go dark and supple again. The stiffness drained from the vest straps. The yellow left the regulator's mouthpiece. The chipped paint on the tanks filled back in. The cracks in the fins closed. The dive knife came up shining. The light drew back and the hum faded. The words read, restored, sound as the day he bought it. Better. The man kept it well, and the keeping is remembered in the steel. He touched the wetsuit. Supple, cool, faintly damp the way good neoprene should feel. He pressed the purge valve on the regulator and it hissed clean. The tank's date stamp red current this year ready. He could feel the weight of full tanks. Why, he said, why give me all this? Because the previous operator cannot use it and you cannot earn without it, and a wheel that will not turn helps no one. Consider it the first morning, the one you do not have to open yourself. His father hadn't reopened these doors every day. He'd opened them once on the first morning, and after that it was just a matter of keeping them open. The system was handing him that first morning. The price, he understood without it being written, was the wheel. He had to turn it, every day. If he stopped, all of this would mean as much as the dust he'd found on it this afternoon. That was a price he could pay. On the prep counter, where there had been nothing an hour ago, things had been laid out for him. A harpoon, a hand sling, dark hardwood shaft, barbed steel tip, thick rubber tubing at the butt. The oldest kind, the kind that asks everything of the diver and forgives nothing. He lifted it, and it balanced in his palm before it had any right to. A pole sling, quiet in the water, the fish do not hear it coming. It will take what your eye finds and your breath can reach. The rest is you. A small fisherman's knife, floating handle, short edge that wouldn't rust. For the water and the dock, bleed the catch at the surface in the first minute before the flesh can turn. A mesh catch bag with a sturdy clip. What you take from the water you must carry up. This carries it. And a small wooden box. When he lifted the lid, the smell reached something in him before he'd identified it. Good rice. A paper twist of gray salt. A bottle of soy sauce that smelled of cedar and thyme. A head of garlic. And at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, a small crock of doenjang, dark and dense and alive. The larder gives what the land gives. This last is not from the larder. This is his, held back, kept against the day the doors opened again. You have what you need for one morning. Use it to begin. But the first meal should not fail for want of salt. He stood there holding the open box, thinking about a man who had kept back a portion of his best paste against the day his son came home. He thought about Doyun in the doorway with her arms crossed. You don't even know what he put in the soup. Maybe she was right, maybe she wasn't. The pain resolved into a quest card. First quest, greet the sea. Go down to the water as he went down. Take one thing from it with your own hands. Bring it up. Make it into a meal for one paying guest. Rewards 50 pearls. Experience in both disciplines. Unlock the logbook. Hint, resonance pays. Learn the guest before you cook. Not buy a fish. Take one. From the same water his father had been going down into since before Doyun was born. He was going to the water first. The thought of it sat in his chest in a complicated way. He'd spent 20 years convincing himself that his father's work wasn't something he needed to understand. He was about to find out if that had been true. The pain folded itself away, until only the first words remained. Welcome to the tide table kitchen. And below that, sleep hand Doyun, a tired diver makes poor decisions. Then the kitchen was just a kitchen again. Dark and cold, one tired man standing in it holding a harpoon he didn't know how to use yet. He closed the lid on the wooden box and went to find his father's boat. It was at the end of the third pier where it had always been, tied between two larger fishing boats like it had never expected to be anywhere else. The wood was weathered almost to silver. The outboard motor looked like it had opinions about whether it was going to start, but the hull was sound. He stood at the edge of the pier in the dark, town lights up the hill behind him, and thought, I am going to get into this boat alone and dive into cold water in the morning, and the only thing helping me is a system I cannot explain that apparently knew my father. His sister thought he was going to fail. He got in anyway. Chapter 3: Into the Water. He slept in the boat. He hadn't planned to. He'd anchored in the shallow cove south of the harbor that his father used, sheltered by a low headland, and he meant to stay awake and go through the dive log entries he'd half memorized. Instead, the rocking did something to 11 days of not sleeping properly, and the next thing he knew there was pale gray light in the east, and the birds had started up over the water. He lay there looking at the sky and thought, today is the day I find out what kind of person I am. Then he sat up and got ready before he could think any more about it. He'd studied the dive log by lamplight before leaving the restaurant. This cove showed up in the early entries often, marked in his father's shorthand as the morning spot. The depths were modest, 10 to 15 meters. The entries described rockfish mostly, sea bass occasionally. Common things, good things, the kind of fish that ended up in a bowl of rice and made a person feel like they'd been properly fed. He suited up in the boat. The wetsuit went on smooth and fitted close like it remembered what it was for. Vest over the top, straps cinched, tank clipped to the back plate. He breathed off the regulator, listening to the cold, dry air come back to him. Weight belt, mask, fins. The harpoon and catch bag clipped to his belt. He sat there suited up and looked at the water. The cove was calm. The reef below showed as a vague, darker shadow through the green-black depth. No one else was out here. It occurred to him that no one knew where he was. He thought about his father going out alone every morning for 30 years because that was what the work required, and he put the mouthpiece in and went over the side. The cold hit him all at once. For a long second, everything in him said no. Then the wetsuit warmed against his skin, and he was floating in the early dark with his own breath loud in his ears, and the surface a silver ceiling above his head. The system woke up at the edge of his vision, quiet as a thought. In the upper left, his depth, currently just under 1 meter. Below that, an air gauge in 5 segments, all lit. Beside it, suit rated to 18 meters. Current equipment, upgrade available. In the lower right, a compass needle. That was all. He'd half expected a flood of information. Instead, it was almost restrained. It told him what he needed and left the rest to him. He took a slow breath and let himself sink. He equalized every meter or so, pinching his nose through the mask and breathing gently against the pressure. The first few times he did it wrong and had to stop and wait, floating in place while his ears complained. The depth counter sat in the corner of his vision, patient and neutral, not commenting. At 5 meters, the reef began resolving from darkness into shapes. Rocks covered in pale coralline algae, ribbons of kelp swaying in a current he could barely feel. Small flickers of silver where fish moved between the fronds. The air gauge showed 4 segments. At 10 meters, the colors shifted. Red's gone, everything in greens and blues. The reef opened out into actual landscape, ridges and crevices, and the dark gaps between rocks where things lived. A small icon appeared above a shape moving along the bottom. A simple outline barely there. Below it, rockfish, common, small. The fish was wedged into a crevice, perfectly still, trusting its camouflage. The icon was faint. He kept going. He found the first decent fish at 11 meters. A rockfish, larger than the others, sitting out in the open on a flat shelf of rock like it had nothing to worry about. The system put an icon over it, a little brighter than the ones before. Rockfish. Uncommon. Decent size. He took his time getting into position, moving slow, trying to do it the way the harpoon felt like it wanted to be used. He drew the rubber back, sighted along the shaft, and fired. The tip skipped off the rock 2 centimeters from the fish. The fish was gone before the sound of it finished traveling through the water. He floated there and looked at the empty shelf for a moment. Then he retrieved the harpoon and kept moving. The air gauge showed 3 segments. The second attempt went worse. He spotted a sea bass hovering in a gap between 2 large rocks, a better fish than the first, and he maneuvered into position over it carefully and took what he was certain was a good shot. He wasn't certain. The shaft went wide by a wider margin than the first time, and the fish didn't even flee dramatically. It just drifted sideways like it had somewhere better to be and disappeared into the kelp. He hung there in the green water, 14 meters down, watching the empty space where the fish had been, and felt something that he would have called embarrassed if anyone had been there to see it. His sister's voice came to him unbidden. "You don't even know what he put in the soup." He also didn't know how to use a harpoon, apparently. The air gauge showed 2 segments. He was burning through it faster than he should have been, the way you breathe faster when you're frustrated, and he knew it and couldn't entirely stop it. One more attempt, then he was going up whether he had anything or not. He moved along the reef face slowly, forcing himself to slow down, to stop scanning and just look. His father had gone down here every morning for 20 years. He hadn't come up empty. He'd come up with something worth cooking and cooked it beautifully, and people had driven a long way to eat it. And if that was possible then, it had to start somewhere, and it started with being patient and looking properly. He looked properly. The system flagged something at the base of a kelp cluster, 14 meters down, just where the shelf started to angle toward darker water. A sea bass. Real one, better than anything he'd seen today, sitting completely still in the shadow of the kelp like it had grown there. Sea bass, uncommon, good table fish. He didn't move toward it right away. He just floated and watched it and made himself breathe slowly, all the way in and all the way out, until his heart rate came down a little and his hand stopped carrying the tightness of the last 2 misses. Then he moved, an inch at a time, with the current rather than against it, the way the water wanted him to move. He brought the harpoon around so gradually he almost couldn't feel himself doing it. He thought about nothing except the distance between the tip and the fish and the angle of his wrist. The air gauge showed 1.5 segments. He drew the rubber back, found the still place at the bottom of a breath. He let go. The tip caught the fish just behind the gill. Clean. The fish thrashed hard against the shaft and then stilled, and Doyun grabbed it with both hands before it could work itself loose, and he bled it with the fisherman's knife right there at 14 meters, quick, the way his father had before the flesh could turn. He held it in both hands and looked at it. It wasn't a large fish. It wasn't something anyone would drive from 2 provinces over to eat. But it was real, and it was his, and he'd pulled it out of the same water his father had pulled fish from for 30 years, with the same kind of harpoon, on the same morning reef. He worked it into the catch bag and clipped it shut. The air gauge showed 1 segment. He started back up. The ascent felt longer than the descent. He took it slowly, watching the depth counter tick back down, the surface brightening above him from deep green to silver white as he came up. When he finally broke the surface and pulled the mouthpiece free, the cold morning air came into his lungs, and he just floated there for a minute, arms out, looking up at the sky. It wasn't a triumphant feeling exactly, more like the specific relief of having tried something 3 times and only gotten it right on the third. His arms were tired. His breathing was all wrong from the frustration of the first 2 attempts, but the bag was heavy on his belt, and the weight of it was real, and he'd put it there himself. He thought, "I missed twice, and I caught it on the 3rd try in 14 meters of water on my first dive in 20 years. My father would probably have caught it on the 1st try, but my father isn't here." Getting back into the boat took more effort and less grace than going over the side had. He sat dripping in the stern with the catch bag at his feet and just breathed for a minute. First catch, sea bass, 14 meters taken on the breath, 45 pearls. He looked at the number. 45 against 3,000 for the wetsuit, against everything else the shop had shown him. The mountain was still the mountain, but it had been 0 yesterday, and the bag was real, and the fish in it had been alive in that water an hour ago. He stripped the wetsuit off and started the outboard and turned back toward the harbor. The restaurant was cold when he got back. He lit the range and set the rice to steam. You don't even know what he put in the soup. He cleaned the fish at the prep counter. The knife moved in his hands with the same quiet guidance it had shown the night before. The scales came off cleanly. The flesh parted where it should. He grilled it hard, close to the iron, the way the dive log entries described. The skin blistered and crisped, and the fat ran, and the kitchen filled with a smell that had no business being in a building closed for over a year. A working smell. 30 years of dinners suddenly present and actual. He built the soup around the doenjang, tasting as he went, chasing the not quite right of each addition until something settled. Went from being a soup to being the soup, the specific one from the log entries, the one that made people drive a long way to get to a small town the highway had bypassed. He wasn't sure if his sister was right. He'd find out when someone tasted it. He plated it simply. Fish, rice, soup, green onion from the windowsill upstairs sliced thin and dressed with a little oil. He sat down on one of the 2 clean stools and looked at it. Quest update. The meal is ready. The guest has not yet arrived. And below that, resonance cannot be earned alone. Learn the guest before you cook, or cook again when they come. He sat with that for a moment. Then he got up and cleaned a second stool, because there was nothing left to do now but wait. Chapter 4, First Customer. The door opened at 7:30. The old man who came in was built like someone who'd spent his whole life working close to the water. Short and wide, bent slightly at the shoulders, hands like knotted driftwood, a face that had taken on the color of harbor pilings. 2 sharp black eyes went across the room in one sweep, taking in the wrecked dining room, then settling on the clean stretch of counter and the plated food and Doyun sitting there. "Sign still up," he said. "Thought someone would have taken it down by now." "I haven't gotten to it yet," Doyun said. "I only just got here." The black eyes came to him and did the thing people in this town kept doing, working backward through the years. When they found what they were looking for, the old man's face moved through something brief and complicated. "Seong-ho's son, the one who went to Seoul." "Han Doyun, yes." "Bae Manseok." He didn't move from the doorway. "I knew your father since before you were born. We dived together when we were young and stupid." He looked at the plate on the counter. "What is this?" "Breakfast," Doyun said. "If you want it, it's yours." "You can't cook. I watched your father try to teach you when you were young. You held the knife like it was going to do something to you." "I've been working on that," Doyun said. "Since when?" "Since yesterday, if I'm being honest." Bae was quiet, then came in and lowered himself onto the stool across from the plate with the economy of a body that had opinions about mornings. He put his hands flat on the counter. "Is that doenjang soup?" "It is." Something shifted in the old man's face. "Whose recipe?" "My father's, or his mother's. I'm not sure where one ends and the other begins." Bae looked at the soup, then he picked up the spoon. Instead of hovering, Doyun rested his arms on the counter and asked the old man how he'd known his father. Bae wasn't easy to talk to. Short observations, long silences. But Doyun had spent 10 years in offices learning to read what people were saying underneath what they said, and he kept asking things quietly, and gradually the old man came open. He and Seong-ho had known each other since their 20s, when they were both convinced they were invincible. They dived together in the early years before Bae's ears gave out. He mostly stayed on boats now, or on shore, watching other people go into the water, which had its own kind of difficulty. His wife had passed 4 winters back. He said it the way you say something you've handled many times, flat and worn smooth, and moved past it before Doyun could respond. He ate alone now. He'd never cooked. He ate what didn't need cooking, or he went to the fried chicken place by the highway, and the way he said that told Doyun exactly how he felt about it. Then Bay said something that shifted the whole conversation. We used to come in off the water in the early days, your father and I blue-lipped, hands too cold to close properly. He was looking at the soup. Siang-ho would always make something. Didn't matter what we'd caught. He always put the doenjang in, his mother's way. I never knew what she put in it. A pause. It tasted like coming in from the cold. That sounds like nothing, but it wasn't nothing. It was the specific taste of being cold and then not being cold anymore, of coming back inside. He picked up the spoon. I haven't tasted that in a long time. Doyun said nothing, he just listened. Then Bay put the spoon into the soup, and the kitchen went quiet. He ate slowly. All of it, the fish, the rice, the soup, the green onion. The way people eat when they're not performing for anyone, when they're genuinely hungry in a particular way and the food is exactly meeting it. He scraped the bowl. He drank the last of the soup straight from it, both hands wrapped around the ceramic. When he set it down, he sat with his head slightly bowed, and then said, very quietly, "You old bastard, you taught him after all." Doyun let that sit without answering it because the honest answer was complicated. His father hadn't taught him, not with lessons, not with intention. But Doyun had spent the first 8 years of his life in this building breathing this smell and watching these hands, and apparently that had gone somewhere and stayed there. The system hadn't created it. It had just opened the right drawer. Whether that was enough to satisfy Doyun, he didn't know yet. The blue pane appeared. Quest complete, greet the sea. Meal graded, 4 stars, fine. Quest reward 50 pearls. Grade reward 30 pearls. And then set apart. Resonance, guest Bay Mansiok, need met, bonus 65 pearls. The grade had paid 30. The resonance paid 65, more than double. The meal was fine, but what he'd actually made was coming in from the cold for a man who hadn't tasted that in 4 winters. The fish was how you got there. That was all it ever was. His counter read 145. Still a long way from anything meaningful in the shop. But yesterday it was 0, and a man he'd never met before had just drunk the last of a bowl of soup and said, "You old bastard, you taught him after all." That seemed like somewhere to start. One last line appeared. Unlike the logbook. A ledger of people instead of fish. One entry fresh. Bay Mansiok, widower 4 winters, former diver depth restricted, knew the previous operator, need to come in from the cold. A page that would fill over time, one guest at a time, a memory he wouldn't be allowed to lose. Bay paid before he left. Doyun had told him the meal was free. Bay put coins on the counter anyway and said, "A free meal is charity. A paid meal is a transaction. Now you're a restaurant and I can come back." Doyun picked up the coins, the first money Himeji had earned in years. Bay moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "Your father's gear. The tanks are out of test and the fins want replacing and the regulator needs a service. I know the man up the coast who does tanks." A pause. "I also saw the boat coming back in this morning when I was walking the harbor." Doyun said nothing. "You went alone, first dive in 20 years. "I had some guidance," Doyun said. Bay looked at him in a way that suggested he had thoughts about this and had decided against sharing them. "What did you take?" "Sea bass, about 40 centimeters, 14 meters down just past the kelp line." "That's sensible." He was quiet a moment. "There's a shelf past the south point, drops off to 40 meters and more. Big fish down there, the kind that made this place what it was. That's what people drove for." His voice changed slightly. "But there are things about that shelf that need to be understood before you go. That's all I'll say right now." Doyun felt the weight of the unfinished sentence settle into the room, alongside everything else that was unfinished here. 5 in the morning, Bay said. Day after tomorrow, I'll be at the harbor. I'll take you out properly. You won't go below 10 meters until I say, and you'll listen to what I tell you. You don't have to do that, Doyun said. I know. The old man stepped out into the morning light. 5 o'clock, don't be late. The door shrieked shut. Doyun stood in the kitchen in the warmth the grill had put into the room, the empty bowl on the counter and the coins in his hand, and the first entry in the logbook at the edge of his vision. He thought about his sister going to her room without slamming the door. He thought about the old man drinking the last of the soup straight from the bowl. One didn't cancel out the other. She was probably still right that this was unlikely to work. But 145 pearls was 145 more than yesterday, and there was a name in the logbook now, and the door had opened once. He went to find a third stool to clean. Then a fourth. Then he swept the floor behind the counter, which hadn't been swept in over a year, and made him feel like he'd accomplished something real. He wiped down the grill while it was still warm, the way the log entries said his father always did. He rinsed the soup pot and the rice cooker and set them to dry. He wrapped the leftover doenjang carefully and put it back in the wooden box. It was past noon by the time he stepped outside and locked the door behind him. He stood on the step for a moment in the thin autumn sun with the key in his hand and the smell of the morning's cooking still on his clothes, and he thought, one customer, one bowl of soup, 45 pearls from the dive and 100 more from the meal, and the old man's coins sitting in his coat pocket. It wasn't much, but it had happened. The door had opened and someone had walked through it and eaten and paid and left lighter than they came, and that was exactly what the place was supposed to do, and he had done it alone on his first real morning. He was still standing there smiling at nothing in particular when he heard his name. His mother was coming down the lane at a pace that suggested she had been walking fast for some time, and the expression on her face was the one he remembered from childhood, the one that meant she'd been frightened and had now converted the fear entirely into something louder. Han Doyun, she said, and that was all she needed to say, really, because she said it the way that made it clear the full name was intentional. Yama. Where were you last night? I went to check on you and your room was empty. I thought, she stopped herself, pressed her lips together, started again. And this morning, nothing. No message, no call. I didn't know if you'd gone back to Seoul or if something had happened to you. I was about to call the Coast Guard. I slept in the boat, Doyun said. She stared at him. You slept in the boat. I wanted to get an early start on the dive. I anchored in the cove and I meant to stay awake and I fell asleep. He paused. I should have told you, I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long moment, and then her eyes went to his clothes, the salt still on the cuffs of his jacket, the faint smell of cooked fish that no amount of moving around in the open air had quite gotten rid of. Then she looked at his face. You went diving, she said, this morning alone. Yes. In your father's gear. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. A woman walking past with a bag of groceries glanced at them and kept moving. The harbor sat below them, bright in the midday light, the boats nodding. Did you catch anything? His mother said finally. A sea bass, about 40 centimeters. And you cooked it? I did. Another pause. She reached out and straightened the collar of his jacket, the way she'd been doing since he was small, and her hands were gentle even if the rest of her wasn't quite ready to be. You should have left a note, she said. That's all I'm saying. You should have left a note. I know I'm sorry, Iyama. She made a sound that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite not forgiveness, and she tucked her arm through his and turned him up the lane toward the house. Come and eat something that isn't fish, she said. You look like you haven't slept. I slept in the boat. That doesn't count. He let her steer him up the hill, and the coins from Bay's meal were still in his coat pocket, and the logbook entry was still sitting quiet at the edge of his vision, and his mother's arm was through his. And it was, all told, a better first day than he'd had any right to expect.